This documentary discusses biological research incidents and policy implications. All information presented uses verified public records and expert testimony. In the spring of 1979, a cloud drifted over a Soviet city that would rewrite the rules of modern warfare. What escaped into the air that April morning killed dozens, triggered an international cover-up and forced the world to confront a terrifying question. What happens when the most? This is the story of Sverdlovsk. And nothing about biological weapons has been the same since. Sverdlovsk, now called Yekaterinburg, was a closed Soviet city about 900 miles east of Moscow. In 1979, it housed military facilities, ceramics factories, and roughly 1 million people living under the secrecy protocols of the Cold War. Among those facilities was Compound 19, officially listed as a vaccine research center, but suspected by Western intelligence of housing something far more dangerous. On April 2, 1979, an unusual outbreak of what Soviet authorities called intestinal anthrax began killing workers and residents in the southern districts of the city. The official story blamed contaminated meat from a black market operation, but the pattern of deaths, the speed of the illness, and the military's immediate response suggested something else entirely. This incident would become the most documented suspected biological weapons accident in history, and it changed how nations think about lab safety, transparency, and the unspoken rules of biowarfare forever. Lower third, April 1979, Sverdlovsk Oblast, USSR timeline of key events. The first victims appeared on April 2nd. Factory workers in the Chkalovsky district, located directly downwind from Compound 19, began arriving at hospitals with high fevers, difficulty breathing, and chest pain. Within 24 hours, previously healthy adults were dying despite aggressive treatment. Soviet doctors recognized the symptoms immediately. Inhalation anthrax, one of the most lethal forms of the disease and almost never seen in natural outbreaks. By April 4th, the Soviet military had mobilized a massive response. Troops in protective gear scrubbed streets with disinfectant. Authorities quietly removed medical records from hospitals. Dogs in the affected neighborhoods were shot and burned. The official explanation, released weeks later, claimed that residents had eaten meat from cattle that died of anthrax, a disease that occasionally affects livestock in the region. But intestinal anthrax caused by eating contaminated food looks nothing like what doctors were seeing in their wards. The deaths continued through mid-April. Hospital staff worked around the clock, administering antibiotics and oxygen, but the mortality rate was devastating. According to leaked medical documents, the majority of victims died within 3 days of symptom onset. Source: Messelson et al., Science Journal, 1994. The geographic pattern of cases formed an eerily precise line extending from the military compound toward the southeast, exactly matching the wind direction on April 2nd. Western intelligence agencies detected unusual activity through surveillance and communications intercepts. CIA reports from May 1979 noted the large-scale decontamination operation and the suppression of information inside the USSR. Document Declassified CIA Memorandum 1980. But without access to the city or medical records, Western governments could only speculate. The Soviets maintained their contaminated meat narrative for over a decade, even as epidemiological evidence suggested otherwise. The break in the story came years later. In 1992, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russian President Boris Yeltsin admitted that the outbreak had originated from a military facility. Source: statement reported by AP Reuters, May 1992. Russian scientists who had worked in the biological weapons program began speaking to Western researchers, providing insider details about what happened that April morning. Pattern break. Question: what could cause such a precise geographic pattern of infections? According to testimony from Dr. Kanatjan Alibekov, who later defected and became known as Ken Alibek, technicians at Compound 19 were working with weaponized anthrax spores. On April 2nd, a clogged air filter in the production facility needed replacement. For a brief window, possibly just hours, the filtration system that prevented spores from escaping into the atmosphere was either removed or compromised. Source: Alibek testimony, Biohazard Memoir, 1999. During that time, an exhaust system released a small amount of anthrax spores into the air. The amount released was estimated at less than a gram. But anthrax spores are microscopically small, incredibly hardy, and inhalation of just 8,000 to 10,000 spores can be fatal to an unvaccinated person. The plume traveled downwind, invisible and odorless, settling over neighborhoods where people were simply going about their morning routines. Evidence and verification. Most comprehensive scientific investigation came in the early 1990s, when a team led by Harvard molecular biologist Dr. Matthew Meselson gained access to Soviet medical records, autopsy reports, and interviews with survivors and doctors. Their findings, published in the journal Science in 1994, provided forensic-level evidence. Source: The Sverdlovsk Anthrax Outbreak of 1979. Science. November 1994. The medical evidence was definitive. Autopsy reports showed hemorrhagic thoracic lymph nodes and hemorrhagic mediastinitis, the hallmark pathology of inhalation anthrax. No victims showed signs of gastrointestinal anthrax, which would have been expected if they had eaten contaminated meat. Document autopsy records reviewed by Meselson team. The timing of deaths aligned perfectly with the incubation period for inhalation exposure, 2 to 6 days after the release. The geographic analysis was equally compelling. Meselson's team obtained addresses for 66 documented victims and plotted them on a city map. The resulting pattern formed a narrow plume extending southeast from Compound 19, consistent with wind records from April 2nd that showed winds blowing at 4 to 5 meters per second from the northwest. Source: Soviet meteorological data, April 1979. One small village located 50 kilometers downwind also reported livestock deaths from anthrax in early April, suggesting the cloud traveled far beyond city limits. Tissue samples preserved from victims were analyzed years later using modern genetic techniques. Studies published in the 1990s and 2000s identified the specific strain of anthrax, confirming it matched strains used in weapons research programs. Source: Genetic analysis. Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, 2001. The strain showed characteristics of laboratory cultivation rather than natural environmental strains. Lower third. 66 confirmed deaths, with estimates of 100+ total casualties. Documents that emerged after the Soviet collapse added institutional evidence. Declassified internal memos showed that Soviet officials discussed the incident in coded language and coordinated the cover story about contaminated meat. Document: Soviet Ministry of Health Communications, accessed through Russian archives. KGB reports indicated surveillance of Western journalists and diplomats who were asking questions about the outbreak. Conflicting views and gaps for years, Soviet scientists maintained that the intestinal anthrax explanation was accurate. Some Russian officials continued to dispute the lab leak theory, even after Yeltsin's admission, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial or that Western researchers misinterpreted medical data. A small number of scientists have suggested that both a natural outbreak and an industrial accident could have occurred simultaneously, though this explanation does not account for the geographic precision of the victim distribution. Significant gaps remain in the full accounting of what happened. The exact number of deaths is still uncertain, with estimates ranging from 66 confirmed cases to over 100 possible victims, depending on which records are considered complete. Source: Various epidemiological studies, 1990s-2000s. The Soviet cleanup operation may have prevented documentation of some cases in rural areas. The technical details of the filter failure remain partially unclear. Testimony from facility workers has been inconsistent about whether the problem was a maintenance error, an equipment malfunction, or a procedural violation. Some accounts mention a supervisor ordering the temporary removal of a filter. Others describe a seal failure. Source: Conflicting testimony cited in Alibek's accounts and Russian investigations. Pattern break. Info card. Confirmed: inhalation anthrax from airborne release. Unconfirmed exact mechanism of filter failure. Questions about the military's response also persist. Why did decontamination efforts focus on certain areas and not others? Were there classified protocols for such accidents and were they followed? These operational details remain protected by Russian state secrecy laws. Human impact: the victims were ordinary people, factory workers heading to their shifts, grandparents tending small gardens, A ceramics plant employee who had just returned from vacation. Most were between 40 and 60 years old. Healthy adults who should have had decades ahead of them. They died in hospital wards, struggling to breathe as their lungs filled with fluid and their bodies fought an infection they had no way to understand or prevent. Families were given virtually no information. Bodies were buried quickly, sometimes in sealed zinc coffins with instructions not to open them. Survivors and relatives were questioned by security services and told not to discuss what happened. The trauma of those weeks, compounded by decades of official denial, left psychological scars that only began to be acknowledged after the Soviet Union ended. Medical staff who treated the victims worked without adequate protection in the early days of the outbreak, before the military intervened with equipment and protocols. Some healthcare workers were exposed and fell ill themselves, though most survived with aggressive antibiotic treatment once the true nature of the disease was recognized. Expert lens. Why it matters. Think of anthrax spores like microscopic seeds made of armor. Unlike most bacteria, anthrax can form spores that are almost indestructible, surviving heat, cold, and sunlight for decades. When breathed in, these spores wake up inside the lungs, multiply rapidly, and produce toxins that damage tissue faster than the body can respond. It's why inhalation anthrax has such a high mortality rate, even with modern antibiotics. The Sverdlovsk incident shattered several important illusions. First, it proved that even highly controlled militarized facilities could have catastrophic accidents with consequences far beyond their walls. Second, it demonstrated that cover-ups in the age of satellite surveillance and international scientific cooperation have limited shelf lives. Third, it forced a global conversation about the Biological Weapons Convention, signed in 1972, which banned the development and stockpiling of biological weapons, but lacked enforcement mechanisms. The incident influenced how labs handling dangerous pathogens design containment systems. Modern biosafety Level 4 facilities, which handle the most dangerous organisms, use multiple layers of filtration, negative pressure systems, and fail-safe mechanisms specifically because of lessons learned from accidents like Sverdlovsk. Source: CDC Biosafety Guidelines, evolved through 1980s-90s. The idea that a single point of failure could release lethal agents into populated areas transformed safety engineering and biological research. On a political level, Sverdlovsk became shorthand for the gap between international agreements and actual compliance. The Soviet Union was a signatory to the Biological Weapons Convention, but was clearly violating it when the accident occurred. This revelation strengthened calls for verification protocols and inspection regimes in arms control treaties. It influenced how governments approached later agreements on chemical weapons and nuclear materials. Mini recap: we know that, on April 2, 1979, weaponized anthrax escaped from a Soviet military facility, killing dozens of civilians in a narrow corridor downwind. We know Soviet authorities covered it up with a false narrative that lasted over a decade. We know modern forensic science and testimony from inside the Soviet bioweapons program have confirmed the basic facts. What we don't know with absolute certainty is every detail of how the filter failure occurred, the complete casualty count, or what exact strains and quantities were being produced at the time. But the weight of evidence points to one conclusion. This was the first definitively documented case of a biological weapons accident causing mass civilian casualties. Pattern break. The real question isn't what happened. It's what it means for labs around the world today. What's next? The broader implications continue to unfold. Research into dangerous pathogens is expanding globally, with hundreds of high-containment labs now operating worldwide, from China to Africa to North America. Each facility represents both scientific opportunity and existential risk. High-confidence scenario: continued improvement in lab safety standards and international cooperation on biosafety protocols. Organizations like the WHO and the Biological Weapons Convention review conferences maintain pressure for transparency. Most facilities operate without major incident. Medium confidence scenario: another significant lab accident occurs somewhere in the world within the next 2 decades, possibly involving a pathogen more transmissible than anthrax. The international response may be faster than 1979, but political tensions could still hamper investigation and containment. Low confidence scenario: A biological attack or major outbreak with lab origins leads to a fundamental restructuring of how dangerous pathogen research is governed internationally, possibly including mandatory international inspections or a global ban on certain types of research. The Sverdlovsk case remains the touchstone for these debates. When scientists, policymakers, and security experts discuss lab safety or biological weapons risks, they inevitably reference that April morning in 1979. It's the historical proof that the unthinkable can happen, and that when it does, the human cost is measured in lives that never should have been lost. UTRO and CTA, the lab leak at Sverdlovsk, changed how the world thinks about biological research, military secrecy, and the price of progress. It showed that invisible threats can be just as devastating as visible ones, and that transparency, however delayed, eventually breaks through even the most determined cover-ups. If you want to understand how the international community responded to these revelations and tried to prevent another Sverdlovsk, watch our next investigation. The Biological Weapons Convention, Why the World's Most Dangerous Treaty Has No Teeth. It's the untold story of global diplomacy trying to prevent the unpreventable. Thank you for watching. This story was researched using declassified government documents, peer-reviewed scientific studies, testimony from Soviet weapons scientists, and investigative journalism from the 1990s and 2000s. As new information continues to emerge from Russian archives, we update our understanding. All major claims in this documentary are supported by multiple corroborating sources. Links to key documents and studies are available in the description below. Source notes and disclaimer. This documentary is based on the 1994 Michelson et al. Study in Science Journal, declassified CIA and State Department documents from 1979-1992, testimony from Dr. Ken Alibek, Kanatjan Alibekov, published in Biohazard and Congressional Hearings, Russian government statements including President Yeltsin's 1992 admission, genetic studies published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, investigative reporting from the period, and interviews with survivors and medical personnel conducted by researchers in the 1990s. Some details remain disputed or incomplete due to continued Russian classification of materials. This documentary presents the most widely accepted interpretation of events among historians and scientists who have studied the incident. No graphic imagery or medical details beyond what is necessary for public understanding have been included. If you found this story informative and well presented, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel.